Well, good afternoon and good morning to those of you joining us from points further west. My name's Tom Jenkins. This is David Bennett. We're going to start the webinar in a few moments, so just letting the participants spool in. It takes a couple of minutes because we've got over 200 people registered for this, so it naturally takes some time. Okay, well, as I said, good afternoon. Just to repeat myself, my name's Tom Jenkins. I work at ETOA, the European Tourism Association, and I'm delighted to be joined by David Bennett, our long-time veteran of indirect taxation discussions. I think David and I have been talking on this subject, I suddenly realized, for nearly 25 years, which gives us all pause for thought, I suppose. Today we haven't got any formal presentations. We haven't actually got any formal news as such. I just wanted to take this opportunity to do a quick roundup of those live topics which are out there that we're aware of. You may be aware of other ones in addition. Before the industry really goes into operational PERDA / summer assess. And I would just stress to everyone that you can please do pose questions using the Q&A. Some of you have very kindly posed questions before the event, so we've got 3 questions tucked into our sporran to pull out later on. But we will be, but it's great if we have some questions flowing in from you as well. So please do. And just so you're aware, this webinar is recorded and will be available through the website, the ETOA website, within the next couple of days as well. Okay, now David, I think we've got sort of 3 broad topics we're going to be covering today. Firstly, I was just going to look at the latest country by country news concerning Germany, Croatia and Italy. And then we're going to go on and look at the latest state of play on the new platform regulations, which the Commission is rolling out. The platform regulations, for those of you who are new to this, is the proposal whereby the Commission is trying to find a way of taxing the sale of product, principally accommodation product, which is otherwise untaxed when it's being sold online. So it would be usually it is a self-catering accommodation or a bed and breakfast being vended by a platform, whether the individual owning that bed and breakfast is so small or for some other reason has not registered for VAT. And they feel there isn't a level playing field between these players and the people who do charge VAT, and they're trying to iron that out. And David will be running through the various ways in which they're trying to do that piece of ironing in due course. And we'll also, the third topic we're going to be covering is the prospects for VAT reform, which is a long story and goes back a long time too. Now, I will just start very quickly by touching on what's happened in Germany. You should be aware that the German proposals to tax non-EU operators who sell German services, which was originally slated to come in, I think it was 2000, and it then got delayed till 2001, then got delayed till 2002, and then was delayed till 2003. Sorry,
2021, not 2001.
I'm showing my age here. You're quite right. Anyway, for what it was worth, it was delayed. It was then scheduled to be delayed to 2024. The good news is that the German fiscal authorities have come through and formally postponed it until 2027. I'm blushing, if you can see the blush in this glare. And that means that operators really have got space now to plan German product in a way that they really have not been able to do for the last 3 to 4 years. And so we know at the moment the Germans have no intention of introducing these rules until the beginning of 2027. We think that they're postponing it, not purely out of the practical problems of implementing it, but also because the Commission has said that they're about to reform these laws. And if they did reform them, everybody would be, number one, changing to conform to what the Germans are currently wanting to do, and then having to change back again to conform to what the Commission is doing. So I think it's an entirely pragmatic option from Germany to do this, but that is fundamentally good news in an area which tends to be quite light on good news. So that was an excellent outcome, and really congratulations to everybody who joined in with us to help postpone this. The slight problem with this process is that Croatia, in many ways imitating Germany, decided to implement laws very, very similar to Germany. And unlike Germany, they've not postponed them. So anybody, and I say this carefully, anybody currently selling Croatian product, if they're based outside the European Union, really ought to be registered for VAT in Croatia, and they ought to be accounting for their Croatian activity in Croatia. They have, not in theory, but in practice, a liability to reclaim all their input tax in Croatia, but pay output tax on anything they sell. Now, how far?
Tom, sorry, just on that point,
yeah.
Before we move on, a liability certainly under Croatian domestic legislation, but not necessarily under European legislation, which of course takes precedence. So it is certainly possible to argue that the non-EU supplier should have no obligation in Croatia based on the European directive, but does have an obligation under Croatian domestic legislation.
But you said supplier. I very rarely get a chance to correct you. You mean the non-European intermediary or tour operator?
Tour operator, yes.
I hope that's clear. I'll just interrogate you on that. You're saying that if you're a non-European operator, so say you're an operator based in America, for instance, in the United States, and you're buying hotel accommodation off a Croatian hotel and selling it as part of a tour in the United States, you have, according to Croatian law, an obligation to register for VAT in Croatia and do the accounting in Croatia. But under European law, you may not.
Yes, it's an arguable point under EU law. The difficulty we've always had for 40-something years in this area is that the European directive on that point is unclear. It's ambiguous. It doesn't identify accurately at all the extent to which TOMS is applicable to a third country, a non-EU supplier. So, of course, this is the big issue in this area that we've had in the UK for the last 7 years, really, ever since we voted to leave the EU. What is the status of a UK tour operator selling EU holidays to be? And it's still unresolved. Germany, for years and years and years, interpreted it to say that, well, a non-EU tour operator selling German services has no obligation in Germany. That's the right way to interpret TOMS. They then changed their view to coincide with Brexit. But it doesn't change the fact that their policy was for 40 odd years to say you're a non-EU company, you don't have any obligation. And that is still the position followed in by most member states. Croatia has gone the opposite direction. Germany was threatening to do so. You hear rumours of, well, one strength or another fairly regularly that other member states are at least thinking of doing similar to Croatia. But even if they do have that idea, they don't do anything about publicising it or trying to enforce it. That's my experience. But always, whichever member state you're talking about, you've got a defence as a non-EU tour operator to say, well, the terms of the directive mean that I have no liability, no possibility to recover input VAT, but no liability to pay output VAT. And the only way we will ever get certainty on the meaning of the current legislation is if it goes to the European Court.
I have an interesting question on that point, which is someone's already popped in and said, as a non-EU operator, should we be looking backwards and building an accrual for tools that have already run, and how far back? What would you do? What would your advice be, David, in this situation?
In general, or for Croatia?
I imagine for Croatia.
Well, that's a difficult one because I'm not an auditor. But a few practical examples. So in the early days of Brexit, I had a number of clients that did set up some sort of provision in recognition of the possibility that VAT would be demanded in almost any member state. And that, I think, it may not have been the majority position, but it wasn't unusual. But over the last year or so, I've heard from a few people that auditors are very reluctant now to accept that. Croatia is probably in a different category, perhaps, to everywhere else. But in general terms, auditors have been arguing that it is inappropriate to carry forward such an amount. It'd be interesting for anybody, well, if anybody on the call based in the UK or indeed anywhere else outside of the EU has any practical experience of the view that others are taking. But certainly I've come across that in the last year, maybe 3 or 4 times.
And it may be worth noting that my understanding, and this is that comes with all sorts of caveats, but my understanding is that this was the idea of this extension of taxation was seized upon in Croatia as they thought it would be a good way of stopping Serbian, i.e. non-EU wholesalers from undercutting Croatian ones. I think it would be, I would stress that it's this is a policy or a ruling that has not been widely publicized by the Croatians. So it really is up to you to decide how you judge that situation. I have no knowledge of any long-haul tour operators being pursued by the Croatian authorities at the moment, but I think I have to say, on balance, it's perfectly clear that that's what the Croatian law is at the moment. And until we hear otherwise, it's going to be set as it is. I need to touch on Italy. Fascinating though Croatia is. We understand that in Italy, the authorities have reactivated a fairly ancient law. I believe it dates back to 1972. So this is a 50-year-old law, which says that operators, irrespective if they're outside Italy, indeed, if they're anywhere, have to apply VAT on the normal rule principle when vending standalone accommodation. Again, this is a very odd thing for them to do, but we believe that this is something which is a fairly routine application within Italy. It's one of the things that Italian tour operators and wholesalers can avail themselves of. And the Italian authorities are wishing to extend this as a sort of, not just an option, but a compulsory principle outside Italy. Now, the logic behind this must be that they think they're going to generate some revenue from it, but the legality of it seems fairly clear. David, I mean, is this something they're entitled to do?
I would say no. Back in 1972, conceivably yes, but certainly not since TOMS was introduced And it's fairly clear under binding European case law that supplies of accommodation only, in the circumstances that TOMS is ever going to be applicable, so basically somebody buying in the accommodation for resale, in those circumstances, the use of TOMS is compulsory. So we had a European judgment all the way back in, I think it was 1992, the Van Hinkel, a Dutch case, which told us that. And then a lot more recently, a German case, Alpen Chalets, about 5 years ago, I think, confirmed that accommodation only was to be taxed under TOMS. And as if that wasn't clear enough, a Polish case just last month, how it ever got to the European Court is a bit of a mystery, but anyway, it did. And again, confirmation that supplies of accommodation on their own are eligible, indeed compulsorily, to be included in TOMS. So there's little, if any, support under European regulations for the approach, I would suggest, that we understand Italy is planning to take.
My understanding, there was even a case in the Italian High Court where a foreign operator asked to reclaim its input tax from the hotels and was told by the Italian High Court, no, you've got to account for it under TOMS. So it doesn't seem to stack up domestically or even within the remit of the ECJ, yet it's happening. So I think just watch this space. One of our members I know has been approached reasonably aggressively by the Italian authorities and has been reasonably robust in its reply. So we may have more information in the next few months.
I think it's also probably appropriate to maybe draw a distinction here between EU and non-EU suppliers of Italian accommodation. An EU supplier would be expected to account for local TOMS VAT, and therefore if they paid Italian VAT at all, it's highly unlikely that they would, but of course they would then be being double taxed. If they chose to pay Italian VAT instead of their local TOMS VAT, then I guess their local tax authority would be unhappy with them, so they could get into trouble there. It's not so clear, and it's coming back to the same point again, what is the true position of a non-EU supplier, but it's much easier to imagine that if Italy rather, let's say, challenged a non-EU supplier of Italian accommodation under this approach, that they would get a much more sympathetic hearing, should we say, in an Italian court than if they tried to challenge an EU-based supplier of the same service.
Right. Okay. Well, I think I sort of watch this space, I think, on the Italian subject. I don't think anybody need to be unduly frightened by what they're doing, but you ought to be aware that it's happening. Now, that's what's happening on a country-by-country basis, as far as we're concerned. Those are the leading issues. David, what's happening on the platform economy?
So we had a set of proposals in December last year. That was a step in a process that was already 18 months or so old. It contains a number of measures, but most importantly for us today, a proposal that online platforms should, in certain circumstances, be liable to pay VAT on the full selling price of short-term rentals and passenger transport. And as Tom said in the introduction, broadly speaking, that is whenever the supplier, the property owner, whoever it might be, is not accounting for VAT. So this would create an obligation on platforms, no matter where in the world they are. So this is an EU measure, but it would be applied equally to non-EU platforms to pay VAT separately in each of the member states in which the services they facilitate are deemed to be subject, excuse me, to VAT. So a platform could end up paying VAT at different local rates in multiple member states. There has since been a process of discussion between the Commission, the member states, and other interested parties. We were expecting a revised proposal. I have to say, I've seen nothing in the form of a revision formally to the first set of proposals from December. If anybody participating today knows to the contrary, please do to update us. But that's the position as I understand it. There are lots of uncertainties. The very definition of, well, there's a platform for this purpose. What legal status or contractual status would the platform need to have? It had been understood, broadly speaking, that the platform would only be caught by this if it was operating as a disclosed agent. But there was also a suggestion that it might be widened so that somebody selling in his own name would also be required to pay VAT on this basis, which then begs a question as to how these rules and TOMs would interact. There seemed little doubt that an OTA would be considered a platform for this purpose. I've heard within the last week or so that the European Parliament has been looking at this and is proposing an exclusion from the rules for what I believe they've described as small OTAs. Now, I don't think there's any sense of what small means for this. Again, if anybody can amplify on that point, please do. But it does seem as though the Parliament, at least, is recognising the difficulties that this might have for small OTAs, presumably small platforms, full stop. But I don't think the Parliament has any formal power in this. I think it just has an advisory role. So as I understand it, the Commission and the Member States would be perfectly within their rights to ignore what is coming from the Parliament in this area.
Just 1 second, just to clarify, an OTA is an online travel agency.
Yeah.
It was a question that someone raised. Please carry on.
Thank you. The one additional point, and it's not a part of the platform proposal, but a case in France on the treatment of holiday accommodation and similar is, I think, of some interest. Now, where this does link into the platform is that a part of the Commission's proposal is that in every single member state, the accommodation in question should be treated as taxable. However, France, to name but one, has an exemption at the moment for accommodation which is not considered to be similar to accommodation in the hotel sector. And France has had a set of practical guidelines to help decide when accommodation becomes similar to that provided by a hotel. My understanding is about a month or so ago that the French domestic courts decided that the French rules in this respect are not reliable, and basically that it was necessary to consider the circumstances of accommodation on a case-by-case basis, and not have a sort of overriding set of guidelines that had little room for, what am I trying to say here? Had little room for some freedom, if you like, in terms of identifying the true nature of what a service was like in any given case. So it's a technical change in France. It does complicate things there, I think, in this area. Does potentially lead to a situation in which accommodation property owners typically will need to consider this on a case-by-case basis, and may be seen to increase the circumstances in which a property owner becomes liable in future to register and pay French VAT.
Yeah, and so I mean that's chiefly of relevance to those of you who are small French property owners, and I don't think necessarily are included in our Venn diagram, but it would be of relevance to people who vend small French accommodation, individually owned French accommodation on their website, and it will have ramifications on the platform debate. Not dramatic, but it's in the background, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the platform debate pans out, even if you're not directly affected, because it will illustrate, if nothing else, the complexity of trying to come up with a solution to a perceived problem. And I think it's very much a perceived problem that there is an unlevel playing field between the people who are paying, having to account for and pay for tax on their on the accommodation that they're providing through these platforms, and those who don't. But we shall see how this one pans out. David, before we go on to prospects for reform, which is an old favourite of ours, we've got some questions which have already been posed, and I'm going to try and open them up. Well, there's 3 people very kindly submitted a question. The first question was from Greece, and they just simply said, when can overseas principals claim back VAT on incentives and meetings in Greece? So it's really MICE functions in Greece. Can you reclaim the input VAT? When can you claim the input VAT?
My understanding is only very, very rarely, if at all, in Greece. We maybe, again, need here to distinguish between an EU and a non-EU organiser of MICE. I think as far as an EU supplier is concerned, it's highly likely that Greece would say no input VAT recovery, you're in TOMS. I should say I've got no particular experience of how Greece operates in this particular area, but basically every time I have come across what Greece does in the travel sector in general terms, it's been, we apply TOMS. So I think they would say they apply TOMS to this, which would prevent an input VAT recovery. If it was a non-EU MICE supplier, then it may be a little bit different. Here, perhaps there's an opportunity to say, well, I fall outside of TOMS, therefore I should be entitled to register in Greece. But that's unlikely, I think, to be beneficial. The best I think you could get for in that sort of situation would be a recovery of input VAT and a payment of output VAT. But to be honest, even in that situation, I'm not at all convinced that Greek rules will actually allow a recovery of the underlying VAT. You could end up with an obligation to pay output VAT and no ability to offset the input VAT, which you shouldn't really get to, but I wouldn't like to suggest that it's that you're bound not to end up with that problem when we're talking about Greece. So I think it's extremely difficult. I mean, I don't know who asked this question, but if you would like to speak to a Greek specialist on this, we can certainly put you in touch with somebody.
I mean, there are 2 caveats I have to that. One is that virtually, not in every country, but in many countries, there are instances of striking exceptions being granted locally. So there may be some parts of Greece where they do permit this. I mean, I've come across instances happening in other European countries where the local VAT office comes up with a different ruling, and it may be worth pursuing with this, as David said, a specific Greek expert in this area who may have a particular understanding of the situation. I think the second point is to raise it. I mean, there are ways of constructing it that it would be beneficial. The only instance I can think of is that if the Greek authorities are saying that all MICE work has to be treated under TOMS, and if David is right, and that there is an exception possible for non-EU operators, that non-EU operator would be able to gain exception gain that exception and reclaim the input VAT on the understanding that they forwarded the output VAT, that they pay the output VAT. But that invoice would itself be a VAT invoice, which could be reclaimable by a VAT business if he was forwarding it onto the VAT business.
Yeah, I think, Tom, even if you manage to get yourself registered in Greece and issue a Greek VAT invoice, again, it's far from certain that your business client would then achieve a recovery on the VAT.
Right.
They're probably coming across as unduly pessimistic on this, but every time I've come across an issue with Greece, it just hasn't been possible to achieve a VAT recovery position.
You've got an answer at any rate. Let's go on to the next question. I'm a tour operator based in the UK, and if I sell a tour to an overseas business, do I have to charge them VAT? Over to you, David. I think it's a straightforward answer, but shoot.
Sorry, was the question for a UK?
Yeah, I'm a tour operator based in the UK. If I sell a tour to an overseas business, do I have to charge them VAT?
No. You could be in Tom's, of course. You're not charging VAT. You're accounting for VAT on the margin on a UK tour. But a more normal treatment in the UK, I'm assuming here it's a wholesale supply, i.e. one made to a client that will resell. If it's a wholesale supply and it is a tour package, the UK rules allow a recovery of all of the UK input VAT on hotels and restaurants and attractions, catering, etc., without the need to pay any output VAT, to charge VAT to the overseas client. So I think the answer in a nutshell to that, I think the question was, can I recover the VAT? Yes, you can.
If only such questions were so many questions, easy and straightforward to answer as that. The third question we have is are there fiscal possibilities or rules to avoid charging VAT to clients from abroad purchasing travel services? And the similarity that he's pointing to is that obviously when you're exporting goods, they're allowed to reclaim the VAT on these exported goods. I think the question is effectively, how can we find a way of not charging VAT to clients who are enjoying services in Italy?
Right. Well, if we're specifically looking at Italy, I think it would be very difficult. I mean, at Tom's, as far as a tour package, my understanding is that Italy has a fairly standard approach. So it would be within the Italian version of Tom's, whether it's B2B or B2C, which would prevent any VAT recovery on Italian costs.
So can I just stop you there? I want to explain B2B is business to business. You're selling to another business. B2C is selling to
okay. Yeah.
Keep going. David, back to you.
So that would prevent any recovery of Italian VAT. If it was Italian accommodation only, then going back to the conversation we had before, the Italian rules would allow for that, maybe even require that to be excluded from Tom's, which will allow, in theory, a recovery of the VAT on the purchase cost, but it would necessitate the payment of Italian VAT on the selling price. If you sold that, let's say, to a tour operator in a different country, which then incorporates that accommodation into a tour package, then Italy, I think, would consider Tom's to be applicable, and therefore the VAT charged by the Italian supplier of the accommodation would be irrecoverable by the client. So you don't really achieve anything in that situation. More broadly, as I said, if it falls within Tom's in Italy, then that's going to prevent the recovery. I think, to be honest, I don't have any practical experience of this. I think in the MICE sector, particularly the conference sector, Italy has in the past allowed recoveries, but that's a fairly specific set of rules, I think. But again, quite frankly, it's the sort of issue that you'd need to speak to an Italian advisor on to get proper advice.
Thank you. No, I think you're right. Okay, well, those are all the questions we have so far. There's still time to receive some more. Reform. The Commission's been looking at reforming the tour operators margin scheme on and off for the last 23 years. I mean, the last big
Yes.
proposal we had was in 2003, if I remember rightly. And that took a few years to come to the table. And they know the current situation doesn't work perfectly. And they're desperate to try and reform it into a situation which seems to be fair. And I was just wondering where they are on it at the moment, David.
Well, Tom, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is a long story. Certainly, as far as the Commission is concerned, and we think at least for many of the member states, there's been renewed enthusiasm over the last 5 or 6 years, maybe, for a reform package. There was a public consultation in 2000, I think, and on the back of that, the Commission appointed some consultants, the same consultants, incidentally, that did the work for the platform proposals. They reported around about the end of last year, and it is basically going through the Commission procedures. So there have been discussions with member states and other interested parties. We were led to believe at around about Christmas time that probably we would have a formal proposal from the Commission fairly late on this year. I understand, although I don't have any information older than about 2 months, I think, on this, but the situation a couple of months ago was that probably it would slip back into Q1 of 24. So it's, I think, realistic at this stage to think that in less than a year we might have a formal proposal, but it doesn't really seem to be moving that quickly. I think certainly over the last 6 months or so, the Commission and the member states have been focusing more on the platform rules. That's the impression I get, rather than Tom's reform. They are linked in a way. But it is still certainly very much on the agenda that these rules could be changed at some point in the next few years.
I think that's a brilliant way of putting it. I think the thing to realise is that there are many. The beauty of the tour operators margin scheme is it's a simplification, and anybody doing operating tours in Europe does not want to end up in a situation where everything applies according to normal rules, which would involve everybody registering for VAT in every country in which they're purchasing product, and accounting for it according to the various VAT protocols that abide in each country on every tour that they function on. It would be a logistical nightmare for that to disappear, that important simplification. But along with that simplification, at the moment, there is no way, my understanding is that the countries can come to an agreement as to what they can do with non-EU operators. And there is a huge disparity in treatment of an operator saying, wanting to sell to the United States, to consumers in the United States, being based in France and being based in Switzerland. One would have to account for VAT on the price paid by the consumer. The other one wouldn't. I think it's the right way of phrasing it. And I think people appreciate that there is a level playing field on that front. The logical thing for them to do is to declare that the margin is payable according to where the consumer is based. And this would remove a lot of the unfairness at one fell swoop, but that involves taxation authorities agreeing to exempt such things. And I've been debating this very point with them since I arrived at ETOA in 1997, and they have been repeatedly pointed out to me is that, Mr. Jenkins, you're making a very good case, but the word exemption is not something that forms part of our vocabulary, where the taxation department were not the taxation exempt department. So it goes against very much their DNA to come up with such things. but we will see what happens because I think logic is on that side. But we'll see what the proposals are when they come out, if they come out Q1 next year. All right, I've got no more questions here. David, do you have any corrections to make to my statement?
No,
All right, okay. Okay, well, look, it's just down to me to thank David Bennett very much for giving us his time and expertise. It looks like we might have a question. Here we are from an old friend of the taxation discussion area. Could the elections for the EU Parliament in June 2024 have any impact on the timeline of the reform process? I assume that's on VAT.
I don't know. Tom, have you got a view on that?
I don't think it will. It's a short answer. I don't think the indirect taxation of tour operators' margins forms much of the debate around the hustings for the European Parliament. I think this is something which is debated in closed rooms amongst consenting adults rather than general population. But I may be proved wrong. But thank you very much for that question. Ladies and gentlemen, with that thought, I'm going to leave you in peace. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for turning up. If there will be more information about this, if there is any more information about this on the website, and we will probably aim to talk to you in late Q3, early Q4 later on this year. And we'll certainly be in touch if there's any news. Thank you very much and have a great summer.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.